Well, if you'll come with me, you'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too.
You float too!
A Stephen King podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 9 of We'll Float Down Here, a Stephen King podcast. I'm Oscar.
I'm Simon.
And today we are going to be talking about Pet Sematary. This is a 1983 novel, and originally Stephen King didn't even want this published because he thought it was too scary, which is really saying something for Stephen King.
Tipped into something pretty dark within himself, and he decided that, it was not for public consumption. So what changed his mind, do we know?
Probably because it's very good.
Yeah, probably a reread of some kind, and went, actually, you know what? We've referenced this the whole way through, that as we get to this era, the early to mid 80s, King is this total hot property. The films are piling up, the books are piling up. He's writing under a pseudonym still. He's doing short novellas on the side. All sorts of materials happening. There's a big novel every year, basically. So
there was 2 big novels in 1983. Christine was in 1983 too, so this is literally in the same year.
So that's crazy. And
insane. And then in 1984, he wrote 2 fantasy books, one being nearly 1,000 pages and the other being like a decent sized book.
Yeah.
So
he's
wild.
and the movies are piling up and piling out, and they can't keep up with demand. And this is a special book for both of us. But this is the first Stephen King book I ever read. So 35 years ago, I read it, and I loved it, and always sort of referenced it as one of my favourites, always thought it was an incredible book. Have revisited the movie a few times, but had never read the book again until just a couple of weeks ago. In fact, a week ago I finished it.
This was also my second Stephen King book, second Stephen King novel. I'd read a few novellas first. So
an important one for you.
Yeah, this is also an important one for me, but I did see the movie first in 2020, and I read this in 2022 or 3, so I was one of those horror films that I watched just as a horror film, not with the idea that it was a Stephen King adaptation. So we'll talk about the movie at some point.
And do we want to talk about our editions? What have you got?
Yeah, so I've got this really, really cool cover with the cat on the grave. Yeah. It's a vintage copy. Sadly, the spine's a bit faded. I hate when you get a really cool second-hand copy and the cover's faded. It's just such a vibe killer. Then we have this very boring hardback, which you've also got.
Yeah. Your little Ellie Pop is sitting on that.
Yeah, with her little cat friend. And then we've got the movie edition from the remake, the 2019 tie-in. This is the copy I read, and it was the only copy I had for ages. I think I got all of my other copies late 2024, and I had this ever since I started reading Stephen King. It was one of the first ones I bought. And then maybe my favorite is this really cool one with not really a movie tie-in, but it's kind of got that sort of kind of like a 2019 one. I've actually got 4 copies of this, and this might be the first one where I have more copies than you.
Yeah, it is. I think it is. I actually just have, I have the same hardback edition, which is, we don't need to hold up. I have this old copy, which I quite like. It's a good cover.
Not very good.
But the actual edition, it's faded, and then I have one of my other language copies, so German language, which I picked up for very cheap, and I kind of quite like having those. I don't have the cover of the original copy I read, so I'm hunting that out. I do also recall that your lovely vintage copy I did actually buy for myself, and in an attack of the guilt I gave it to you because
that's not true.
That's my take, and that's what I'm sticking to.
That's not true. That is not true. You've got a very, very bad Pet Sematary collection.
So I am probably going to get one more copy of this. I would love to track down.
You definitely should.
I would love to track down the edition I read. So keeping my eyes out for that. And there are some other cool, just with the cat on the cover, there are some pretty cool interpretations of that, and the cemetery motif as well. Either of those. But yeah, a really important book for me because first Stephen King book I read, first adult horror genre novel that I can remember reading properly, because I had probably read like a young adult children's version of Dracula and Frankenstein before I read the proper versions, like a modernized, simplified version of that. So really the first significant horror book I read. And I read it not in 1983, I read it in 1990. So the first movie version was available to watch. So one of the first times that I watched a movie, read a book and went straight to the movie adaptation. So I was excited about that as a concept.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
So should we talk about this book?
Yeah, give us a rundown.
So basically the plot is a family of 4 and their cat Church move into this house with a huge amount of property around it. There's
it's a rural.
There's a weird path that leads down to a pet cemetery where a bunch of kids in the neighborhood bury their dead pets, and it's it originated from 100 years ago up to this point. And there's dead dogs, there's dead cats, and there's even some weird stuff like dead squirrels and stuff like that, and dead rabbits.
And there's a main trunk line, trucks drive past. So the idea being a lot of these people's pets have been killed by big trucks driving past, and that's why the Pet Sematary is still being used, and that's why it's a thing.
And basically the whole book has this concept of the Pet Sematary bringing cats back to life, and they bury their cat, and basically it turns into a zombie cat. And it sounds very silly, but this book is actually very serious. It completely twists, and it even brings up the concept of, could a human be buried there and brought back to life? But we'll get into that. It's kind of a very difficult book to explain the...
Yeah, when you start talking about it like that, you make it sound like it's quite hokey and quite... and also this is one of those books...
But it's not. It's definitely not.
This is part of the thing that because King had done, kind of in a row, he'd done the savage rabid dog, then he'd done the car that had taken on a life form in a way and a personality of itself with Christine, and now animals coming back to life and the idea of a haunted pet cemetery. This was when people were starting to lampoon him and go, oh, what's it going to be, a talking book? What's it going to be, a backpack that comes to life? And people were making fun of the idea that Stephen King just wrote about haunted properties, things that could come to life. But actually, Pet Sematary's got this amazing human drama, family drama story going on that written really, really well. Much like Cujo has.
Kind of, yeah, what I'm about to say about Cujo, we said in Cujo in our podcast that this isn't the very common take, but I thought, and I'm pretty sure our guest Pitt thought, and I think you thought, that the family drama of Cujo was possibly even better than the claustrophobic second half.
Yeah.
But I honestly, I completely think the same with this one, because I feel the second half of Cujo is kind of what makes the book, but this book, even though the whole concept is about the pets and that's kind of what people might recognise, the whole point of it is the family drama.
Yeah. And
there's a complete twist on it. It just around about halfway, the plot basically changes,
and
so that's why it's super hard to
and
say a concept of it.
And incredible characters. And
this book is home to one of my favourite Stephen King characters of all time, Judd Crandall. He's the next door neighbour. He's this 80-year-old man, and he's really cool. And
he's played quite winningly. I mean, we'll get into the films. There's some issues with the films for sure. But he is played quite winningly by Fred Gwynne in the original Pet Sematary movie.
100%.
That is a great characterisation of him. And it was interesting going back and reading the book all these years later. And I had the picture of him and his voice in my head. I did not have John Lithgow's voice or picture in my head who plays him in the remake. Who is a great actor. Who was a really great actor, but was probably wrongly cast, and certainly at any rate had quite literally big shoes to fill by stepping into that role, because it's so synonymous with that original actor.
Judd Crandall is my favourite Stephen King supporting character.
Yeah.
And the good thing about him is that there's not really much to his character.
It's one of the first times that, I think it might be the first time that King really taps into this folksy, almost hokey but really charming main character, which is his home territory, and that becomes a bit of a trope that he develops and revisits across his later catalogue from here. So I think it's a really important character for him, hence why it's written with so much love. The book is also written in the time period where King is allegedly drinking a lot, and taking drugs, but particularly drinking, and he's a young father, he has a young family, and it's another book like Cujo particularly, where it's kind of one read of it is it's an existential horror about being a parent. It's filled with parents' worst nightmare scenarios, and even from the having to break the news to a kid that the pet has died. That's the first one, and then it escalates from there hugely.
That's kind of when the book gets going. Like there's all this great setup, and then there's like that moment where he's at home by himself, and his family, like his wife and his kids, are like at the wife's parents' house.
What are their names? He's Lewis.
He's Lewis
What's
Creed.
her name?
Rachel Creed. Ellie Creed.
And
Gage Creed.
They're great characters, the parents.
And you can't forget Little Church.
But they're great characters, particularly, I think, the parents. Like,
all of the characters are great.
Yeah, but there's a wonderful... And, for me, like, I read it when I was really young, and in a different era, and I was reading it for the shock value of reading Stephen King, and I was reading it for the literal take on the title. And so, whilst I processed it and loved it as a book and it stayed with me, I don't think I was really understanding it and reading it that first time around.
When I first read it, I sang, but I feel like I kind of got it this time.
For not just the human drama, but the portrait of a marriage. Like, it's quite an amazing portrait of a married couple. And it's a stronger portrait of a married couple than obviously Cujo, which is about a disintegrated marriage, a breakup. This is about these people love each other. This whole family love one another, and it's a really amazing bit of writing around that.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, he wakes up and he gets that call from Judd Crandall across the road saying there's a dead cat on the road and it might be yours, and they go down and then they realise it is the cat, and then they bury it, and the next day it comes back alive and it's like covered in dirt and it's very angry and it's hissing. And
yes, it's got a whole different personality.
Yeah, and
it stinks.
It stinks. And yeah, it kind of sounds like Christine, like the way that it's super goofy, but it kind of works. Christine, like, it kind of works because it's goofy. Like, it knows it's been goofy. This one just is kind of, it's got that little bit of a goofy premise, but he executes it in a way that just doesn't make it feel
So I remember
goofy.
when Holly came out, a very recent novel, you read the first couple of pages to me, and you loved that device that King did where he gave you, in a page and a half, all of this backstory about a character, and then it pretty much finishes with an X amount of time. What is it, a year and a half or something?
It's like this dude who's like 40 years old, and he's like, oh, it feels so strange to be 40. He's trying to like get his life back together, get in good shape, and how it feels so different to not be 39 and to be 40. And then the last line of that chapter is, he wouldn't even make it to see 41.
That's
and
right.
It's just brilliant.
Yeah.
Sadly, Holly, the book, in my opinion, didn't end up as good as that first page, but still.
The reason I get you to reference that is there's a passage similar to that in Pet Sematary where he writes in the Eye of God narration for one of the younger characters and says, in 2 months' time, he wouldn't be here, or something like that.
Stephen King does all of that.
And it's the
Cujo. Maybe in Salem's Lot, I think.
But it's
with
so
Townsend.
Yeah, that's right. But it's always so pretty much always so effective.
A lot of people don't
like it. I love it.
I actually think the use of it in Pet Sematary is not great.
Really?
In my opinion.
Wow.
Maybe we should just get into Pet Sematary spoilers now. So, when this really turns, into,
You can spoil a book that's 40 years old.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, we're going to spoil them all, so if you don't want to be spoiled, maybe don't watch our podcast of a specific book. But this book completely turns when they're having a picnic, and we said there's like a extremely long road with a bunch of trucks going down it. Gage, he wanders off.
Who's the toddler?
Yeah, the toddler. No, he's not even a toddler.
Well,
he's like 2 years old, right?
Yeah.
Or 3 or something. Like, he's only just saying his first words and stuff like that. And he wanders off, and they don't notice, and he goes onto the road, and he gets hit by a truck and dies. And yeah, he does that thing about the transition to part 2, and part 2, that's the first chapter where he dies. And the transition to part 2, he's like, oh, you know, he wouldn't make it, he'll die in 2 months. And it's like, I feel like it would have possibly been better if it just gave that shock.
No, I love that.
I think we could have seen it first and just been completely shocked, because it's still shocking, and it's so the first time I was kind of reading it for the zombie cats, and I was you know, pretty young. I was like 10 or something. I was like 10 or 11.
Yeah.
I was year 6, so I wasn't really reading it for that. This time, I almost cried. It's like, you know that feeling where tears are at the back of your eyes? I don't think I would have cried, because, you know, it's only words on paper, but the fact that it got me as close to that, it's crazy, because there's that whole, really, really jarring, part afterwards of all the family members' reaction to it. And,
which is
sister's reaction to it. The sister's only, 6, 5 actually, I think. And she's eating all of his cereal and reading all of his books, and it's just very sad. And she thinks he's going to come back to life, and it's awful.
There's that brutal funeral scene that has hints of some of what goes on in Salem's Lot too.
Is it that scene where
the
Rachel's dad and Lewis get into a fight?
Yeah, the father-in-law.
That's devastating.
Yeah, that's
devastating.
really tough and really, really brilliantly written. It's really tough. Yeah, I was so pulled along by this book. 35 years later, I thought, you know, I'm going to just skim this. I know what's going to happen. I already have the gist of it. But much like Cujo, I found myself quite enthralled by the story in a different way. And I would put that down to, in both cases, you know, not just being an adult, but being a parent. And they're both heavy parenting related books. So
I can see how reading this as a parent would just be traumatizing.
Yeah.
And it's not scary in the way of how Salem's Lot is scary, or, you know, Carrie is scary, you know, the traditional horror. It's just scary in the way that it's just so messed up.
Yeah, and
it's real.
And it stays.
Apart from the zombie cats, it makes the thing that's so made up into a real life horror. And it's so cool.
And as it escalates, the idea of this brand of horror stays with you to the very end. And, you know, I think it's one of the more effective Stephen King endings.
Yeah.
That some of his books are often maligned for
he does this thing where he leaves it open for interpretation in heaps of his books, and lots of the times he does that it sucks, but this time it really, really works. So his wife Rachel dies at the end, which is the 20th death in the book. It's every cast of character dies, even John Crandall dies, and it's awful. He buries her in the Pet Sematary, and she comes back to life at the end, and she just puts her hand on his shoulder, and then it ends. And keep in mind, this is the second time he buries an actual human in the thing. He buries Gage, and he comes back to life, and that part's hilarious. That part, he's this little toddler going around killing people and swearing. It's super funny.
Yeah, it's kind of Chucky.
Yeah, it's like Chucky. It's really like
many
Chucky.
years before
and
that.
I love Child's Play. I love Chucky.
I wonder if it was a big influence for the Child's Play series. Quite possible.
Yeah, because you know, the movie came out, and then you know, Child's Play would have came out a few years later.
So yeah, but also it has this whole existential thread of, you know, you're haunted by that which you can't escape and can't run from, and what you create. So, you know, Lewis has created this extra world basically for himself as a way of trying to cope, but he's also not thinking straight.
Yeah.
And then the things that he tries to put in place literally come back to haunt him. But it's also so it's a commentary on all of that, which I think is pretty cool. But it's also really taps really deeply and really, quite brutally but beautifully into grief. And part of the cycle of grief is not thinking straight, and not being prepared to let things go. And it takes grief to a kind of an illogical extreme, I guess. And again, that's where a very real life horror is baked into this.
The execution of grief is like absolutely incredible. And also, I read this like around the time that our cat died.
Right, I didn't really clock that.
It wasn't like around the time, but it was either
that was fresh enough in your mind.
It was either a good part before or a good part after, and I think it was after. And it like completely, like even like before it turns into this whole like just absolute mess of just grief and like, babies dying and old men dying. It completely like captures how sad it is to lose a pet, because pets, they feel like family members as well.
So do we want to rate the book before we talk about the movie, or do we want to transition into the movie chat? Because what do you want to do?
Let's rate this book. I'm just gonna this is the first 10 out of 10 that I'm gonna give on the channel. This might be the best book I've ever read in my entire life.
Wow.
I love this book so much. It used to be like my second or third favorite Stephen King, but I started to kind of like, realize how good it was, and I reread it for this podcast. It's a 10. It's a complete 10 out of 10. It's the first, I gave The Shining movie a 10 out of 10. So this is the first 10 out of 10 book that I've given, and the second 10 out of 10 rating. Pip, our guest for Cujo, she gave Cujo a 10. But this is my first 10.
And I haven't given anything a 10. And I loved this book. And when I read it when I was 13, I absolutely loved it. And it was easily my favourite book I'd ever read at that point. And it got me into Stephen King. And then I read a bunch of them and a bunch of other things, and obviously I've read many books that I've loved, but something pretty special happened rereading this book, and I'm, it might be boring to agree with you, but I'm going to give it a 10 as well. I'm going to say this, if I sit around waiting to an award, and there might be other 10 out of 10s, there can't just be, there doesn't just have to be one, but if I sit around going, oh no, that's a 9 or a 9.5, a 10 is coming, I'm just going to give this one a 10. It's just an extraordinary book. It's for its time, it's a great concept. It clearly, to me, holds up well enough. I still think it's an amazing concept. I got actually more out of it on this read. I was able to dig much deeper into I've listened to podcasts that have talked about it over the years. I've rewatched the movie, movie versions, plural. I've read a bit about it. I totally expected to read it with more of an eye for the grief story, but it still hit me very hard as being really effective writing, and one of his more finite stories. It's a sizable novel, but it's not a big doorstop chunker. Like it's quite efficient.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Like it feels epic, but it's the perfect length.
It's the perfect length novel.
Let me see what copy I read. How long it is? It is 460 pages,
which is classic.
It's a pretty good, it's pretty big, but it's like, it feels like epic because of like all the trauma in it, so it's just like the perfect size.
So I absolutely loved it, and one of the great joys of doing things like this podcast is it made me reread a book I probably would not have. I would have wanted to get to it at some point, but I probably wouldn't have ever taken the plunge. So
and I may not have reread it if I didn't have this too. Because I'm rereading a lot of books that I might not even need to, but this one felt extremely it felt like it bring back memories of reading it the first time, and I just loved it so much. So should we get into the movie?
I have ridiculously 3 different copies of the original Pet Sematary movie. We've got one back here. We've got this one, which is part of a series called the Page to Screen Collection. And this one I got recently, which has got a fantastic cover that's kind of close to your...
let's do to
your vintage book
side
cover.
By side, they actually look very similar.
So I got that one just because I do love the cover. and obviously DVDs don't cost a whole lot of money these days. Directed by Mary Lambert, came out in 1989, I think. So would have just come out as a VHS tape in New Zealand around the time that I would have finished reading the novel. So it would have been probably a new release.
This movie
Yeah.
flops.
Yeah.
It's not great.
It's not great. That's
And
why it's funny I have 3 copies of it.
It's written by Stephen King. The screenplay is written by Stephen King.
Yeah.
And yeah, as we said, Judd Crandall, great actor, like great choice of who, like the person.
No
who did a
one's
great
bad
job.
in it.
And also Lois Creed, he basically looks exactly like how I picture him, pretty much.
Yeah. No one is bad in it.
I think Ellie's performance, I know it's like kind of, it's not great to, make fun of kids actors because they're like little kids, but like she's very annoying in my opinion. But like apart from that, great cast. She's just very whiny and annoying.
It has a Ramones song in it, which some people love the idea of, and some people think that's just funny and ridiculous because the Ramones were essentially over by then in a lot of ways. I've always quite liked that song that was written for the film. I like the mood of the film a lot, but it does not deliver.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
I like it for the reasons, I have nostalgic reasons for liking this. And I think it has really good intentions. But do you know what? And actually, we'll just jump ahead and say, so there's a remake, which I have as well. Now, both of these individual films, if you like, have sequels that are essentially not canon. Like, they're unconnected, really, sequels.
Yeah.
Pet Sematary 2 from the early 90s is one of those terrible straight-to-video Stephen King-related sequels, like Firestarter 2.
I didn't watch it, but surely it's not as bad as Firestarter 2.
It is not as bad as that, but it is not far off it. It's just a film that doesn't need to happen, and I have great nostalgia for them, as I say, because I grew up with them and they were a big deal seeing them. But the remake of Pet Sematary weirdly might do a few things better than the original. But do you know what they both don't get right? They don't understand how to translate, because I think this is a bit of a topic. Like, a lot of people agree that Pet Sematary, if not top tier King, it's right at the top of the second tier. It's a well-respected, well-loved book.
I completely don't like these movies.
But these movies don't do them justice,
I wouldn't
right?
choose to watch them
No,
unless I'm
you're
doing
watching
some type of binge.
Yeah.
And I actually just really, really don't like the original. There's something about it, even though like the cast is good, and it's got like that really good like last 15 minutes with the Chucky-esque like little kid. That's pretty cool, and like the cat is cool, but. And also, they don't do a great job.
Well, do you know what it is?
Whole grief
Yeah, that's
aspect.
exactly it. They fundamentally, because they're a movie, I'm quite interested in this. I feel like they are a great example to hold up for what the difference is between a book and a movie. They fundamentally misunderstand what the book is about, and they decide, because they're trying to be a quote-unquote horror movie, they go for the scare factor of the coming back to life.
Yeah, but then it also just like confuses me how Stephen King gets so mad when someone messes up his story, but he can't
messed
even
it up
write.
himself.
Wait, has he written a good screenplay of his book? Like, has he ever?
Well,
like he wrote The Shining for Mick Garris.
Mick Garris.
That was. I actually like it more than most people, but it's still very mediocre.
Yeah. Lacey's story looks pretty good. I have yet to read the book, so I stopped watching it, but that is his project.
I haven't seen or read
that he's written. So I think he got there. And there's been a couple of other ones more recently where he's had more of a hand in it. But no,
he just makes bloated messes, and it's very boring in my opinion. Like, it's a snooze fest.
Yeah, I think it just gets it wrong. I think this time watching watching the remake this time around, I liked it more than I did the first time the remake. I'm like, it's actually got a good mood about it.
Yeah, should we rate the original before we get into the remake?
Yep.
I think I'd like the remake. I mean, I think I'd like the original more than I do if the book was not as good. Like, if it was an adaptation of a less good book.
Yeah.
Since, from what I can tell, Pet Sematary is probably my favourite Stephen King book.
Deserves better.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
I'm gonna rate it like a 4 out of 10. 4 out of 10. I think like maybe technically it deserves a 5, but it's so boring that it's just gonna get a 4.
I'm going to give it a 6 because I own 3 copies of it and I've watched it a lot. So I need to do that to...
6 is pretty generous.
It is generous, but I need to do that to preserve some level of sanity about myself. Because if I gave it lower than a pass mark and had watched it lots and had 3 individual copies of the same film, I'd feel a bit silly. But it's not strong. It's not strong, and it's not one that I plan to watch again now, having been through it. I'm not even going to rate Pet Sematary 2. If you really wanted me to, I'd give it 2 out of 10. It's garbage. But the remake from, what, 2019?
This movie was...
When was this?
2019. And I've got my...
You've got the tie-in.
I've got the tie-in, yep.
Yep.
I thought this movie was pretty fun, you know. I don't think I'll ever watch it again unless I'm doing some type of binge, as I said. But like, it's.
Do you know what we found with this too? For an M-rated horror, not a total scare fest. Kind of has some jump scares. It's well made. Like,
we had the sound very high, but I was getting jump scared quite a lot, and I don't usually get jump scared.
No, and we were having fun with that.
And it's not particularly scary, you know.
But we were having fun with that, and the ending, and I give it points for flipping the script and trying to do something different.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about that
Yeah.
soon. I just want to say, one thing I noticed about this is it felt like it was made for the movies. Like, I feel like it would have been a fun horror film to see.
Agreed.
And it does a decent job at, like, trying to kind of, like, encapsulate that grief, but they kind of brush over it. I think their whole purpose was, like, trying to make a very fun horror, like, just cliche
I think
horror
so.
flick.
I mean, you're in the
And it
era
kinda
of
works.
the It remake, and King's a hot property again with movies. You know, you can see why they wanted to dash something out that was, you know, part of the upper canon of his work.
My opinion on those, like, on the 2, like, main movies, is that the original Pet Sematary, which I think is very boring, and I rated it a 4 out of 10, I think it's a better adaptation of Pet Sematary, the book, even though it's still not a great adaptation. I think it's a better adaptation than the remake, but I think the remake is a better movie, a more enjoyable
I understand
movie.
what you're saying,
And should we talk about, like, that very, like, the
so
different
there's a
things?
very, I mean, I wasn't following the blogs and dialogues around it at the time, but I imagine this was a pretty controversial move. So they set the scene up for the kid, the boy, to die. Just the same kind of thing. It's essentially playing out in much the same way, right? But then at one crucial moment, they switch it, and it's Ellie that dies, the girl.
Ellie, I knew that Ellie died instead of Gage before watching it, and I was kind of like, oh, that's not great, like, that's not a great move. But I think I kind of warmed up to it when I realised they were doing that kind of, like, you know, for the actual fans of Pet Sematary, like...
It's giving you something new.
Yeah, and it's also just, like, the way that it, like, switches, because you think that Gage is going to die, and it makes it look like that. So it's not like they completely, like, disregard the, you know, the source material. They actually, like, just twist it and go, psych, you know?
And that's part of
cool.
that.
But do you think at the end of the day they did it because, like, it's less graphic? Obviously it's still brutal, but, like, she's like 7 or 8 and it's technically better than killing a 2-year-old. Like, I'm just saying, do you think there's, like, a possibility that they did it because it's a little lighter?
Yeah, I did think that it's still brutal, as you say, but I did think that's a possibility. I also think it's it's give the fans something different and play with them, like, you know, mess with them. And it's kind of fitting into the sort of meta commentaries on horror that the Scream franchise has created, right?
Yeah,
like the whole, we're making films for film fans and we want to play with your expectations and see if we can trick you. But it's still faithful to that's the funny thing about both movies. They're weirdly pretty faithful to the book, but they get it wrong at the same time. And it's that thing that...
This one isn't that faithful.
No, not really, I suppose. But
also,
storyline-wise, it kind of is. It follows the beats.
As a very big Judd fan, Judd's portrayal pissed me off. I get he's a fine actor, but, like... I did not like it.
Didn't work for you. Yeah, I mean, it didn't really work for me. It's one of those iconic...
He doesn't even have that, like, accent. What's the accent?
It's the main accent. Like
Southern accent?
Yeah, no, it's actually the north, but it's Yes,
He
it's
doesn't
Maine.
have that accent or anything.
But it is like a southern accent. Yeah, it's a real
Yeah, yeah.
drawl. And yeah, I just think these movies are adequate. And then this reboot spawned a sequel, which I was so lazy about watching. I put it
Oh
on.
yeah, I wanted to watch this because it's actually a prequel about Judd Crandall.
Yeah.
And I've heard it's terrible, but I actually think it could be quite fun.
So I did watch it a while ago, and I just
You did?
I
The Bloodlines?
yeah, and I just half-assed it and had it on in the background and started looking at my phone.
Did
and
you
started,
think it looked...
You know, looked fine, but I just couldn't do it.
I think it's going to completely just
Yeah.
ruin Judd Crandall. Not ruin his actual, actually ruin him, but it's going to,
yeah.
have nothing to do with actual
totally.
Judd Crandall. Especially if they kind of, reference it as Judd Crandall from the 2019 one. But yeah, making a whole movie about Judd Crandall would have been awesome if, if they do it well, but I don't know.
So did we give a rating to this one?
Yeah, I'm gonna give it... when I do these ratings, I'm fully thinking about enjoyment first. So yeah, even though I did say I think that Pet Sematary 1989 is a slightly better adaptation, I'm gonna give this one a 5 out of 10 instead of a 4 out of 10. So it's still completely just very middle of the road average.
And I'm gonna follow you and give it a 5. I would almost give it a 4, but we did have a lot of fun watching it.
Yeah.
But I have to give it to the original film because that's the one I spent more time with. But you don't need to see either of these films. They don't mean a whole
I've never
lot.
watched them.
But I do recommend the book, even if you're hearing this and we've just
It's my
spoiled it
favourite
for
book,
you because
probably.
it's 40 years old. I still think you can read this book and be quite blown away by it. I really think that. I wonder if he's written a better book, and I guess that's part of what we'll find out as we go along.
I have I wonder if there's one that I haven't read that
Yeah,
I might
yeah,
give it a
exactly.
10, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure. There's another book in my head that I think might be a 10. I'm not going to spoil what that is, but I also reckon maybe I'm going to reread it, so maybe not as well. It's if I do give it a 10, it's going to be a complete nostalgic enjoyment rating because it's a little bit no, I don't think many people think it's a 10.
So what's our next episode?
So our next episode, there was Cycle of the Werewolf, which was in 1983, which means he did Christine, then Pet Sematary, then Cycle of the Werewolf. I don't know what he was on, but he was absolutely
But it was working.
pumping them out.
Yeah.
Cycle of the Werewolf, we're not doing a whole episode on that.
I mean,
because
Cycle of the Werewolf is barely even a novella. It's a really slim story.
It's 100 pages.
With
it's
lots
like a
of
picture
pictures.
book.
Yeah.
And
it's fun. Well, we're going to reread it and we're going to talk about it very quickly alongside an
Eyes
actual
of the
novel.
Dragon.
Yeah.
Eyes of the Dragon is a book that he wrote for his daughter.
So that's his first YA.
It's a child.
Yeah.
It's a children's fantasy YA book. And it's very short. So the reason that we not completely ignoring Cycle is because if
it kind of links to it.
It kind of does link to it because Cycle of the Werewolf is also child friendly.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is going to be a bit of a strange episode. This next one
No
because
movies.
no movies. This is going to be the first episode where there's no movies.
Well, there is a Cycle of the Werewolf adjacent movie which we might look at, but no movie for the main thing that we've been talking
when
about.
you see
No
the episode, it's
no
going to be
dragon.
titled Eyes of the Dragon.
That's right.
It's not going to be a complete double up episode. We're just we'll rate Cycle of the Werewolf and we'll have a little review of it and we'll talk about that movie.
Yeah.
But the main portion of the book, the episode, 3/4 of the next episode will be about Eyes of the Dragon.
And I'm excited because I've never read Eyes of the Dragon. I'm
Yeah,
literally
you still
starting it
haven't.
now.
I've read it twice.
I'm literally starting it now, and I'll tell you something. I just missed it completely in my first run at King. I didn't know it existed until just a few years ago. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. But when I started buying King books again and started reading them again, I found out there was this book from the 80s called Eyes of the Dragon that I had never seen in a shop. So
That's interesting.
I'm pretty excited about it. I mean, yeah, it was just one that I completely missed.
Yeah, I mean, I've read it twice. First time I read it, I kind of skimmed it. Then the second time, this time I read it for the podcast back a while ago. It shouldn't take you too long to read it. It's very short. There are very short chapters because we recognize this took us a long time to do the Pet Sematary podcast.
Yeah, this is our first podcast of 2025. We should have actually said at the top Happy New Year, but we're well into the year now. And yeah, we're going to try and pick up the pace as best we can with these, but we've got a couple of big books that are going to hit us in the face pretty hard.
There's
soon.
some like 1,000 page books coming up, 900, 800, that neither of us read, so you might have to bear with us, you know, we might like have a few slumps, but this next one should be out in about like 1 or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be Eyes of the Dragon. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. We'll see you there.
Thanks for tuning in.